Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. I have a confession to make when it comes to a show like we're going to do today, and that is when I was in class as a grade schooler, I used to make people laugh, and I used to get kicked out of class a lot. One of the running themes and things I like to even share with my guests is the fact that I was probably one of the few kids in a grade school or even a junior high or high school who not only knew the principal, but pretty much their next of kin as well. That's how much time I spent in the office. But you look back on those experiences and you think, how can I apply that in life and maybe have a successful career as somebody who's funny, who likes to make people laugh and entertain as well? But you find yourself snagged as you try to navigate the waters and obstacles that get you to where you want to go. Well, joining us here on the program today is someone who is a former editor of The Onion. He also knows how to make people laugh and what makes them laugh and how to parlay that into a career. The new book is Funny on Purpose. It's the definitive guide to an unpredictable career in comedy. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program our guest, Joe Randazzo. Joe, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You know, I like this. It kind of lays out, looks like almost a dictionary of comedy and comedy careers and writing and the whole gamut of this. Describe for our listeners how this all came to be about.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I used to be the editor-in-chief of The Onion, and then continuing a conversation with my literary agent, who was the literary agent at The Onion, who repped The Onion for some of their big comedy books. I had come across so many books that purported to kind of tell you how to, the proper way to write, or sort of guide to writing, or how-to guide to writing, that I came to him with this idea of, like, why don't I do a parody of one of these writing books, something that's a little more realistic about how people actually write, which is basically comes down to horrible inner self-torment, lots of procrastination, eating snacks, staying up late, not doing anything. So we kind of batted that idea around a little bit, and then he told me that that there was a publisher who wanted someone to put together a book about comedy, just how to get into comedy, sort of getting the sense that comedy is more popular than it's ever been, that people are not only watching it and consuming it, but trying to produce it themselves on, through podcast, YouTube, Twitter, whatever. People kind of almost study it now. And I thought about it for a while, and at first I was a little pretty hesitant, actually, because I think, how-to books that are a little too prescriptive about something as nebulous as, making a career in the arts always kind of irk me or kind of rub me the wrong way, I think people naturally want for life to be encapsulated for them in 8 easy steps. That's perfectly natural. We're faced with chaos every day. It would be nice to know that there are 8 steps we can take to control the chaos, but I don't necessarily feel that those are always helpful. Mm-hmm. So it was hard for me to get into it in a way that I thought would be helpful, but realistic, and sort of realistically reflect what somebody will have to go through, not just professionally or technically, but kind of emotionally, and to a degree even spiritually, to do this job, to kind of follow this path where you have to embrace your most creative impulses, but also be deadly practical,
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I tried to find a way into that where my tone is sort of realistic but supportive, and to kind of bolster all of that, I tried to find somebody in all the major fields of comedy that I really respected, and that I would hope that my readers would recognize and respect, and to interview them and sort of get their take on it, not only how they got into stuff, but sort of how they wield their craft on a daily basis. So that was sort of the formation for it, and the deeper I dug, the more kind of in love I became with the eventual future reader. I tried to put myself in the future reader's shoes and thought, well, I don't actually want to read a cynical parody of writing books. I want to read something that, lays it out straight, but can sort of be on my side. If you're going to try to pursue a career in comedy or any creative art, you've already got multiple strikes against you, so maybe this book can help mitigate all of those strikes.
I think, too, is that sometimes people, as they look to pursue something like this, or let's just say entertainment in general, I think a lot of times they've got an illusion of expectations of where they think it's going to take them. And I remember an interview many years ago, I think it was James Edward Olmos, star of the movie Stand By Me, And he was on a talk show, and he was talking about that. He says, if this is something you really want to do, you want to be an actor, you want to be in films or television shows or on stage, whatever it is, he says if you spend 10, 15, 20, it could be 50 years, you will be successful if you're committed to this. He says, but if you're coming into this for fame and fortune, go find something else to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure that that's something you've experienced probably over and over from people who probably had this false expectation about where this would take them.
Well, I was one of those people.
Mm-hmm.
I knew I always wanted to get into comedy. I always wanted to be a comedian, and I think when I was younger, my easiest relationship to that was, the people I would see in movies like Bill Murray and others who I really admired and
mm-hmm.
loved, or on TV, be it Chris Elliott or David Letterman or whoever. All I could think was, well, I want to be on TV too. I want to be like them, so I want to be famous. It didn't.
Right.
It was much harder as a young, inexperienced person with little wisdom of the world to see that. Well, fame is a result of what you produce through hard work. Mm-hmm. It's not something that you get just because of its very self. Although it's, I guess, a case can be made that in our culture, fame does exist for its own sake. A lot of what we consume is sort of disposable fame fodder. Mm-hmm. But if you really want to make it and really want to pursue a career that's enriching to you as a person, then Edward James Olmos or whoever it was is exactly right. Mm-hmm. One of the people I interviewed, his name's Doug Lussenhop. He's an editor, a video and TV and film editor. Really kind of changed the whole nature of editing, where editing is actually has sort of become, because of his work, a viable entree into comedy. But he's speaking about editing here, but I think it applies to lots of other things too, which is don't worry about where you're going to end up. Just worry about where you're going to start.
Right.
Take the first step, because you don't know what the last step is going to be. You don't know where you're going to wind up going. And that was definitely a big part of the ethos that I wanted to underlay the book with, which is why the subtitle of the book, The Definitive Guide to an Unpredictable Career in Comedy, is actually in a bigger print than the main title of the book.
It
because
is.
It's just...
I like the chicken with the suitcase on the top.
Yeah.
Yeah, you think you're ready for a stage? Well, we'll see what happens after your first moment. I'll tell you a true story. I remember back in high school, I think I was a junior in high school, and I used to stay up late and watch Evening at the Improv. Mm-hmm. And I would watch these comedians and think, well, I could do that. It seems simple enough. And so sure enough, we had some sort of a school assembly, and I volunteered to just go and do stand-up. And they said, really? Okay, well, what are some of your jokes? And I said, well, I can't really do that for just a couple of you guys here, but once I'm up on stage, I'm going to kind of do my thing. Watching the Evening of the Improv, they made it look pretty easy.
Yeah.
So I got up there, and I'm doing my thing, and I've got the audience, sure, for the first minute, but you feel immediately, when that energy somehow gets lost, and you kind of get a little panic, like, how do I capture this back? I managed to do a total of almost 5 minutes.
Yeah.
My first run, but boy, could you feel it, and boy, did you want to get off that stage.
Yeah.
And I think stand-up, to me, really, this is my opinion, is still the purest form of entertainment there is left. That's just my opinion, but there it is. What are your thoughts on something like that?
Well, I mean, I think it's definitely... You could definitely make a case for that, There's a really interesting aspect to comedy, which is that, or to stand-up in particular, which is that it has this kind of tension of duality, which is you have to spend a lot of time alone. You have to spend a lot of time with your thoughts to generate your material. Mm-hmm. But it really comes to life on stage, and it comes to life when the audience is receiving and giving back to you. And when you have that kind of feedback loop, 5 minutes goes by like snap. When there's no feedback loop and it's you just spitting stuff out there, and it's literally being, disintegrated into nothingness, you may as well be alone in space.
I know there's a great white lurking around here somewhere.
Yeah,
it's a matter of time.
It's bad. And then when you feel that panic set in, that's when you start to do bad stuff. You desperately flail. You look for, well, what can I do? I can make a joke about male genitals, maybe that will make people laugh, and you start becoming more and more desperate, and an audience can sniff that out very quickly. And
anybody who's been to open mics understands what we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that, every comedian is going to experience that at some point. Every human being is going to experience that degree of alienating humiliation and isolation at some point. The difference, what makes people special is not that they experience that, but that you expect to experience it and then get up and do it again, despite the fact that it happened once and will probably happen again. That's one of the main things that I think really separates those who are able to work it into a career versus those who either don't even start or sort of give up prematurely.
Well, and just staying on the subject of stand-up for just a moment, for our listeners out there who may be considering it, the first thing you need to do is you have to get up with frequency and do it. That's what open mics are really good for, right?
Yeah, and the nice thing about open mics, most of them, if you're in a relatively decent-sized city, they're going to be populated with other comics. And you're going to have to go around and find a few different open mics before you find the one that has the vibe that you like, because some of them are just people standing around waiting to go on, and it's a cattle call, where there's 40 different people going up.
Right,
Everyone gets 3 minutes. Yeah, and nobody's listening to you and nobody cares. Because they just want to go on and try their material.
Then you figure you'll mess with a bartender, and you already know that's not a line that you need to cross.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's other ones where it's a little more, much more supportive, where it's comics who are there and understand that, the audience is mostly comics. The people who are going up on stage are working out new material. And they'll make a good audience. They'll make a warm and supportive audience, and that's why a good open mic feels like a pretty safe place to be. But it's going to be terrifying your first time, no matter what, probably.
Now, speaking of terrifying too, stage fright is a big thing that I know people experience, and every once in a while you might run across somebody who says they don't really get stage fright after a while, and I would be of the impression, as you write in your book about this very thing when you interviewed Joan Rivers, interestingly enough, is that when you get to that point that you don't feel you have the stage fright, then you're about ready to go out there and die. Well, describe what that is, because for me, stage fright is that feeling of you're scared and you're excited and you want to do well. It's all those things all at the same time, and I think that's what gives you that burst out there. Because I used to like to dance, and so I would dance on stage, and I would feel that, boy, I hope I do a good job. But it gives you this whole different realm that when you just start off your performance, it gives you that sort of rocket burst into a realm where you can ease into and absorb what's going on around you so you can do a really good job, I would think.
Yeah, it's a sort of, I think you described it well. It's a combination of, it's potential. It's unknown potential. You're nervous because you don't know how it's going to go, because you could never predict it. You're excited because it could go well, and you're being given, hopefully, this energy from the audience there. And it's I think what Joan was saying was, if you just get up there and you're like, yeah, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this, it's going to be fine. Then you don't really care as much. You don't really care what the audience is going to say or do. You're sort of running through the motions, and that fear is kind of where discovery is made. There's a lot of comedians who are working today, whether it's acting or writing, TV, film, or whatever, have been trained in improv. It's a totally different ethos, I think, than stand-up comedy in many ways. It's because nothing is written. It's all happening right there on stage, live, for the first and only time, every time. And you have to sort of completely give yourself over to those that you're improvising with and just trust that discoveries are going to be made. And one of the gurus of improv from Chicago is a guy who's named Del Close, and his 3-word description, or his kind of 3-word mantra for improv, is follow the fear. If you move toward the thing that you're scared of, something inevitably interesting is going to happen out of that. And I think there's still, that energy is still there when you're doing stand-up comedy, whether you've been doing it for 1 year or like Joan Rivers for 50 years, and that's a good thing. That's where the vitality comes from, and that's where the sort of the sense that anything can happen, even if you've done a stand-up routine 100 times. Louis C.K. makes it look like he's getting up there and talking for the first time,
right?
Because he knows how to manage that energy. He knows how to kind of read the waves of an audience, and he knows what he's going to say and what punchlines he wants to hit. But how he gets there is going to be a little bit different every time.
And I think improv, too, would also be a great way for people to get into the business, because you're actually working with other people, so you're feeding off each other. And when you said improv and brought that up, one of the first ones that came to mind for me was Bill Murray.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and in fact, it was interesting that one movie icon character he created was the groundskeeper of the movie Caddyshack.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting to hear him in an interview talk about that, because what he had said was originally his role was going to be very limited in what he said. But he just started creating all this stuff, and the director was like, yeah, just keep going with that. You know, and all of a sudden he panned out this character that really wasn't going to be there in the first place. But that's why I love Bill Murray.
Yeah, well, and so much, you know, that was a little bit rarer at the time that Caddyshack was made, but a lot of comedy movies now are really, you know, directors like Judd Apatow in particular, Christopher Guest, you know, they build these characters around improv, and then they have scripts, or they have loose scripts, and then they'll just sort of inhabit these characters and see what happens in the scene, and a lot of that stuff will wind up in the movie because it's just much more natural, it's much more unexpected, things take turns, and they're more likely to go in directions that you might not have seen because they're not going by a script, you know, and it does sort of build this sense in you, because in improv you can, you know, one of the big things that you must never do is deny what somebody says or negate what somebody says. So you're building a whole story, you're building a whole physical scene, you're building a whole emotional scene, you're building your own personal histories right there on stage. So you have to just take what someone says and build on it. And I think, you know, I was trained in improv, and now I'm the head writer on this Comedy Central show called At Midnight, and whenever I'm in a room working with other writers, that's very much what I do. You know, that's what I'm trained to do, is take an idea, see if we can build on it. If it doesn't go anywhere, then we'll sort of let it fall away, but I'm not going to just say, no, that's dumb, you know. Some ideas, as soon as they come out of the writer's mouth, everybody can sense that they're dumb, and those quickly fall away. But I find you don't always need to say it very often, and that very much comes from improv. And what you said about, you know, meeting other people, I mean, that's specifically what happened for me. I was working. I actually went to college for broadcast journalism. I wanted to work at NPR, which I did in Boston, but then I moved to New York and really had a hard time finding any work in public radio. So I was doing some reality TV shows and just working retail jobs. I was at a fruit basket company and was starting to feel, you know, those big 20-something questions about your life, and decided I would just take improv classes, and went to this place in New York called the Magnet Theater, and the first class I took, two of the people had worked at the Onion, and one of them was still there, and one was previously there, and the one who was still there, you know, I don't know, 9 months later, we'd become friends, and she was going to leave, and she suggested me for the job, and then I wound up getting the job. So, you know, my career in comedy was literally launched through improv, too, through the people that I met.
And broadcasting just kind of went to the wayside in a different way, though, didn't it?
Yeah, well, you know, but now you also have podcasts and things like that, which are sort of filling in some of the gaps.
Right. Well, you know, and that's the exciting thing about today's world, is the fact that there are so many opportunities, like, for instance, to pursue comedy. Maybe you don't want to stand up in front of a crowd and do stand-up. You know, maybe you're not interested in being involved in improvisation or sketch comedy, but you could certainly go and you can write, for instance, the Internet. And I know that's one of the things you talk about, are that there are these comedy blogs out there that potentially, if you develop good writing, that you can actually write for. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of different tiers of that. You know, unfortunately, I think still the thing about the Internet is why it's so vast and comprehensive is that most of it is free. You know, it's free to read or free to consume. So because it's free, people don't expect to pay for stuff, which means a lot of writing is not paid. So I think that's just a reality, that if you're just starting out, you're probably not going to get paid for your comedy writing. But that's okay. It gives you practice. It gives you discipline. You know, it should be a little bit. It should be a little bit of a test of your will and mettle. You know, I mean, I think you should feel like you want something enough that you make the extra time to do it. You know. You
know, Joe, I want to touch on that. My personal story, interestingly enough, is I did start my career at an NPR radio station. And it was interesting because what it was a radio reading service for the blind, but it was a really nice station where I worked. It was also, it encompassed their television station and the like. And I just simply started volunteering there, and they said, well, what's your goal? And I said, well, I'd like to broadcast radio. Originally, I wanted to be a disc jockey spinning records, but there I was taking my shot. And they said, okay, well, this guy's coming in here at noon. Why don't you go ahead and interview him for a 30-minute show called Profiles? And I went, really? That kind of seemed awfully fast.
Yeah.
So I did that, but what was most important, and this is for the listeners to know, and what we're certainly hitting on here, is that I began to read the book that this person had produced, so I had some feel about who he was and what he was there for. And as I started doing the interview, I just watched this person across from me really light up like, wow, this guy really did his homework. So he started giving the best of himself.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed that so much. Now imagine I originally wanted to be just a disc jockey, Casey Kasem, something like that. And here I was doing an interview-style show and realizing, I really like this. And at that point, I spent the next 4, almost 5 years at this NPR station, averaging anywhere from 5 to 15 segments a week, each of about 30 minutes to an hour. And I realized one thing Anthony Robbins was right, is that you do something in frequency so you become better at it. So you get these people out here that may want to get into comedy, and they're writing, let's say, for a blog and realizing, well, I'm not getting paid for this, I quit. You don't realize you have a true opportunity to really hone your skill.
Yeah.
And that's what you're clearly talking about.
Yeah, and I think, I think things will start to change to some degree as people figure out how to make more of a business out of the web. People still don't know. There's millionaires out there somehow, but people still don't know how to kind of make a business out of the web. I don't understand how anybody makes money, but you're exactly right. You may not be getting paid, but if you're disciplining yourself, you also have a free platform where you could, in theory, have thousands of people reading your material. And what you're doing is you're building up your skills, you're building up your confidence, and you're building up a packet of your own work that you can then take out and show to other people when the opportunity arises. And those opportunities are going to come from places that you did not expect. And, being able to recognize opportunities and to, while keeping an eye on the long term in the sense of, well, this may not be the perfect job for me now, but why don't I just take it, because I might meet some people, I'll find some new experiences, and who knows what will happen. Every job I've ever gotten has happened through a route like that, where an unexpected meeting with somebody resulted in a phone call or an email 6 months or a year later that led to a job. It really is ultimately still through people. You've got to be, so it's especially important, I think, for people starting out to really put your best foot forward with your work, really give people the benefit of the doubt, and to be a good person. Even if you feel pissed off that you're not getting paid, don't say it at first. Don't be an a-hole about it, and certainly don't broadcast it all over social media. Be somebody who's good to work with. And I think part of that Del Close quote, "Follow the fear," doesn't just apply to when you're on stage. It also applies to your life. I almost didn't take that test to become an assistant editor at The Onion because I was just too worried that I wouldn't get it. I said, well, why bother? 10 people work at The Onion in the whole world. I don't even know who they are. I'll never get this job. I almost didn't do it.
Right.
But then I did, and a week later I got a call at work saying, I'd like to give you a job. And I was flabbergasted, and my whole life changed. So, taking opportunities when they come and being grateful for those that you have and just plugging away. I
really like, your thoughts on that, too, because I remember that I went through a period of time, it was about 1 year to 2 years into this volunteering my time situation, that people would ask me, so what do they pay you to do that? And I'd find myself, the chin kind of going down, eyes to the floor, like, well, I'm not really getting paid, but I'm getting a lot of free books and backstage passes and this and that and the other. And so then after I started reflecting on that a little bit, I realized, wait a minute, I'm sitting in front and interviewing face-to-face the same people that are on all the major network television radio stations around the world.
Yeah.
These are the big dogs here. The other thing I began developing were the relationship with the public relations agents who would pitch the show ideas. Would you like to have this guy or this gal as a guest on your show? So I began learning how to work with that and starting to build a nice big Rolodex with all that. Well, anyway, one thing leading to another, and this is why I like your title, that it's unpredictable, because you don't know how it's going to ebb and flow, sort of a thing. I met my wife through NPR. We developed a show together, which is the show we're on today, and that was 11 years ago.
Yeah.
And there are many people that are out there on the Internet that think they're radio show stars that are asking us, how do you guys make money doing what you're doing? Well, if you really want to make money in radio, then start a show at a radio station where you've got to broker the time and come up with the money every month. Then you'll learn the business side of it.
Yeah.
Once you get to the Internet, this is like pulling candy out of a tree.
Yeah. Well, you can if you kind of strike gold and you do all the sort of steps you need to do when it comes to podcasting or putting something on a YouTube channel, which is constantly updating, constantly, cultivating your fan base, like really, really giving them a lot of access.
Right.
It's almost like you're going to put out a ton of content, and not all of it's going to be as good as some of it, but that's just kind of the name of the game, I think, online. You may, if you build up a huge enough fan base, then be able to start relying on ad revenue. But you're not learning about the kind of stuff that you're talking about. I mean, I guess you're doing it in a different way, but it really is like recognizing opportunities when they come and cultivating those relationships. I mean, what you just said is a really smart way to do it. Like, wait a minute, I'm not getting paid, but I have access to all these amazing people.
Right.
I'm good at my job, and I'm a good person. Like, let's see if I can parlay that into something else. Because, I think I also talk to a lot of people, especially in comedy, who are skeeved out by the idea of networking. They think of it as, like, putting gel in your hair and showing up to a cocktail hour. But
yeah.
people
Boy,
don't.
if it were that easy, right?
Yeah, but people don't realize, if your work is good and you're a good person, nobody's going to think you're networking. Because everybody realizes that the business is built on human relationships.
Right.
So if you're coming at things respectfully and you have something good to show people, they're not going to think that you're a weirdo who's bugging them, or they might at first, but when they see who you are and what you do, it's not creepy. It's just the way things work.
And the truth too about that, Joe, that should be very clear for a lot of our listeners is that frequency is so important. Getting out there with your material or your work so people start becoming familiar with you. I remember the first 3 or 4 years, nobody was really all that interested in whether it was sponsoring or advertising, whatever the case was. We were finding them, but, nowadays we got people contacting us because of frequency of being out there for a while. Generally, you need to see yourself, and this is just a guess, and I don't know if comedy or entertainment's any different, but I don't imagine that it is because it's all really the same thing, that there's like a 5-year hump, give or take, that once you get over that, it'll start to get easier because people are seeing the fact that you're in earnest. You're really hanging in there. You get up to 10 years, and it gets even easier.
Yeah.
And you can't imagine how much easier it's going to get after 15 or 20 years, but the fact is you've put the time in, and there's an Internet sort of a guru that talked about, getting out there with whether it's a newsletter that you have or you're doing a podcast or, YouTube videos, whatever the case is. He says, just put it out there and do it in earnest. And he says, you will have an audience.
Yep.
And they'll show up.
Yeah. So. It is that question of, can I do this every week? Do I have the belief in myself while keeping that long-term goal in mind, that sort of hazy long-term goal? Don't make it too specific, because if you don't meet it immediately, that's another reason for you to give up. But can I keep that goal in mind enough and recognize the value that I'm getting week to week, where I'm growing and learning and disciplining to put that stuff out with regularity, even when you're only getting 85 or 112 views on your first few videos,
in your first year.
yeah, it could be.
No, and it was funny because when we started that, I remember, starting like the AdSense. So what are we doing this for? I said, it didn't cost us anything to get it started,
Yeah.
We only earned a penny last month, okay? 2 years later, we were lucky if we got a quarter, okay? Then finally we got our first check for $100, because you have to earn that much. And now it's several $100s a month.
Yeah.
But this is 4 and 5 years down the road and consistently doing the work. So, it's funny when people come into something like this, and I think there's an illusion out there, especially when it comes to being a comedian who gets that hit TV show, and it's number one, that sort of a thing, that this is something that just somehow happened miraculously overnight. But I know that you know that that's not true.
No, and even in the cases where, there have been a few cases where a Twitter account, for instance, there's one, are we allowed to say curse words on your program?
If you need to. We consider them industry technology, or anyway, go ahead.
Okay, it's Shit My Dad Says was the Twitter account. Became a huge phenomenon on Twitter, blew up. I don't know how many followers he had, 1 or 2 million or 500,000 or something, a lot for the time.
Right.
Spun that off into a book and a CBS sitcom with William Shatner. So all of a sudden you had all these comedians who've been grinding it out for years and years, saying like, what the heck is this? Like, who is this guy? How does he get to, and then you also had lots of people getting on Twitter, coming up with really dumb parody account ideas,
right,
saying, well, I'll get my TV show deal any minute now. But the thing was, he got a book deal and he got a TV show deal, but it didn't last.
Right.
It doesn't have the longevity. It's too specific to the medium of Twitter, to translate it into something else. So there's varying degrees of success, and the good stuff still almost always rises to the top, and I think it's also not helped by when there are these weird overnight success stories. They get blown up in the media, so people think, oh, this is like common, but it's not common. And then, on TV shows like Last Comic Standing and stuff like that, where they're highlighting all of these supposedly new / amateur comedians, a lot of those people have been doing it for 10 or 12 years already, but they've been doing it on a sort of small to medium scale where comedians across the country know them, but not national television audiences. So people get, I think, the idea there, too, that like, oh, you can do stand-up for like 6 months or a year and wind up on NBC. But
no,
it's usually not the case. You're probably not going to be good enough.
Right. In fact, there's actually an excellent documentary on just that very thing where they were highlighting the comedians coming out of Boston. Are you familiar with that one?
No, I don't think so.
That's Janine, I'm trying to remember her name. There was Stephen Wright came out of the same area, and Dennis Leary, all these guys.
Yeah.
And I think it was Stephen Wright was the first one to break out of this pack of people in Boston. And then all of a sudden, all the other comedians were starting to become aggravated because they felt, well, we spent, the last 10 or 15 years doing this. When do we get our break, too?
Right.
So there was a lot of turmoil around that. But it goes back to the point, like, because you're doing it, that doesn't mean you may ever get that big break. The question is, why are you doing it?
Yeah. Yeah, some people are just unlucky. There's lots of comics out there who other stand-up comedians consider to be the best around, but for whatever reason, they just never get that break,
Now, of all the things that you write about in your book, in the Definitive Guide to an Unpredictable Career in Comedy, what would you say was the most valuable aspect to what made you have stability, I guess, in the business?
Personally?
Yes.
Well, I think I put a really high value on treating people with respect. I think there's this sort of idea that comedians are cranky, antisocial, alcoholic, narcissists who never sleep. And yes, I might be many of those things, but I also found that, people will respond to you if you treat them with respect. And, I've been lucky enough to work in comedy organizations. Like, I've done a lot of stand-up and I've done a lot of improv, but I've also managed to work steadily, first for The Onion, then for Adult Swim, and now for At Midnight. I also worked on a TV show called Lie Detectors right before this one, which is a Game Show Network show. But, working really hard, not thinking that your troubles are any different than anybody else's troubles, and respecting those that you work with. I think being a good person goes a really long way. You just have to have talent, too.
There's that, and being willing to say yes to things you just didn't expect to be saying yes to when it comes to different directions this can take you as well, right?
Well, especially, and especially if you're trying to get, for instance, into comedy writing, it's just this weird thing where, I had a great resume. I was the editor-in-chief of The Onion, creative director of Adult Swim, but for a while, I was on my own. living up in Connecticut with my wife and kids at our house there, submitting packets, which are, when you're trying to write for TV, a lot of them will have you submit a packet, which is, what they want to see out of a writer. Submitting packets and just not getting any jobs, and I think sometimes people have this same sort of lofty expectation, like, I'm going to submit my packet for Parks and Recreation, and I should be working on that show next fall. But there's a lot of rejection, even for me, somebody who has had a really strong background, but kind of once you get that first job, which takes a long time, but once you get it, things start opening up for you. And I think you also have to be willing to have your first couple jobs just be writing jobs. They may not be your ideal jobs, but something good is going to come out of them. So also just sort of not being too precious about the kind of work that you take when you're starting out.
And one encouraging thing for our listeners to know about your book, Funny on Purpose, is that it really gives you a feeling that, yes, I can do this. It's just a matter of what I want to do. And I remember I had that same feeling after reading Stephen King, his book on writing. When you read that, it's actually a great read, but you realize it's not as mysterious as a lot of other people who write books on writing lead you to believe it is.
Yeah.
He says it's really like this, but he described an interesting story where he bought this big monstrosity of a desk, and he said he spent the next 6 to 7 years drunk and on cocaine and never really published anything. And then he finally got rid of the desk, and it was all about creating that space where when you go to that space, when it comes to writing, you sit down to write.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it takes an incredible amount of discipline, and you really have to get to know yourself. I mean, I've been writing for years and years, and editing for years, but I've always had just a terrible amount of anxiety. I mean, I thought writer's block was the sort of de facto writing position, for me. It wasn't until I, last year I had a few months where I got to just be at home in our new house and with a new baby, and I just spent time writing. I was able to not have to work during the day and just write. And just by the discipline of doing that every single day, I finally kind of broke through something, in my mid-30s, where I was like, I'm not scared to sit down and write because I don't know what's going to come out. And I think that's just okay. As long as you do something, you still have to be disciplined, and then there's multiple stages to writing, but as long as you're doing something every day when you write, again, good things will come out of it.
And I think all of us will eventually get that break that we hope for, and it's really interesting, I think, too, also for people to feel encouraged by reading the stories of others who have been in the business for a lot of years to realize, okay, so what I'm experiencing isn't really anything new.
Yeah.
And I think one great example of that, and it was unfortunate that he passed because we were actually setting up the possibility of interviewing with the late Larry Hagman. And his autobiography, Hello, Darling. But it was interesting how when you read about this guy's career, it wasn't until he was 52 years old that he finally started making a regular living as an actor.
Wow.
Now, this was a guy that was an I Dream a Genie.
Yeah.
And it just went on, and then finally his career kind of took a turn in the early 70s. What did he do? Something like Beware the Blob or something like that. But then Dallas came along. And that was when it started having that regular, I'm making a regular living paycheck. 52 years old.
Yeah.
Leonard Nimoy was the same way. Started out at the age of 18. Didn't get a regular working gig, which happened to be Star Trek, until he was 38.
Yeah.
So I think it's really good to read that and reading books like yours so people get the context that this isn't this, I'm just going to try it once and boy, everybody's going to discover me and there it all goes. That it's really work, but it's also work that you could come to love doing.
Yeah, and you have to. I mean, that's the thing. Even if you start out wanting to be famous, but you have that inkling, you have that burning desire in you, and maybe you go up on stage and you don't do as well as you want to, and rather than cower, and sort of, maybe this isn't for me, that burning desire is there, and that voice in the back of your head is saying, no, I want to do better next time. I want to blow those guys away next time. Not just to be famous, but because I'm putting myself out there. I care what I do. I care about the quality of what I do. And I, too, like you say, have come to love the craft of writing. I thought before I was kind of good at it, but didn't like all the stuff you had to do. I didn't like all the editing that you had to do to yourself. I didn't like the brainstorming,
Yeah.
I like sitting down and writing when I felt inspired, but that was it. But it's taken me, 10, 12 years to really find my own rhythms and to really appreciate the craft of it. It's still a pain in the butt almost every time, but at least I recognize that there's value in the work itself.
Mm-hmm. There is, absolutely. It's sort of like that movie, The Razor's Edge, which was a Bill Murray movie. And that was in between Ghostbusters and, I think, Stripes.
Yeah.
And it was interesting when the Indian guy says to him, about enlightenment. He says, you guys in the West just don't seem to get it. Enlightenment, or, that sort of satori, whatever it's called, it's in what you do every day.
Yeah.
It's getting up in the morning. It's enjoying that moment you're washing the car, or cooking the meal, or cleaning the house. It's in everything you do. It's not somewhere out there that you search for it. It's always been right here in front of you.
Yeah, and it's interesting, when you were talking about Larry Hagman and Leonard Nimoy, I was just trying to imagine what their daily life must have been like for the ages between 18 and 48 or whatever, and I imagine that they must have been surrounded by good people. I think you have to have good people around you who make you feel not only good about yourself, but who make you feel like there's more to life than just this pursuit. I think you have to kind of have that there. You should always try to do the thing that your heart desires, but to know that, there is ultimately more to life than what your job is. It's just harder for people who that's all they can do, and it's a lot of people in comedy and acting is that's all they want to do, that's all they can do, and it's almost like they don't have a choice. But you also find, I think, that when you support other people and you support their careers and you help them along, like you get that back too when you most need it.
Well, there's no doubt about that. It's certainly a wonderful place to be. There's no doubt that you and I have both enjoyed it for a long time, haven't we?
Yeah.
The book is Funny on Purpose. It's the definitive guide to an unpredictable career in comedy, and how about life in general as well, I would also say as well. Joe, it's been a pleasure to have you here on the program. Is there a website people can find out more?
Yeah, you can go to funnyonpurpose.com. It's in a little bit of disarray right now, but go ahead and
That's
check it out.
That's comedy for you. It's unpredictable.
Yeah, it's unpredictable. And I'm on Twitter at RandazzoJ.
At RandazzoJ. Very good. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. It's been a true pleasure.
Oh, pleasure's all mine. Thank you.
Again, you can find out more by visiting us at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-news updates. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.